Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development here at S2 Breakthrough, joined once again by our very own Laura McDonald, our director of athlete health and performance. Laura, welcome back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I keep welcoming you back, but just FYI, Laura is here to join me for all 5 episodes of this series.
Not going anywhere.
I'm going to keep being like, you're back, and making a big deal of it. So for those of you who are just joining us, hopefully you had an opportunity to first watch episode 1 and 2 prior to watching this 3rd episode, where we're really laying out the inspiration behind this entire series, which is, during our journey of really diving into player development concepts for softball pitchers, we have really discovered how deep the culture of pain really is. Everything from the fear culture around pain, athletes not feeling like they have the freedom to report when something is in pain, all the way to just how it's handled, right? And so how we've really responded. Last episode was about how we have had to design protocols and systems to really help athletes not just manage pain, but get out of pain before it turns into an actual injury. It's something that we really take a lot of pride in because it's a work that we are doing a lot, particularly in season, especially the back end of a summer where most of our athletes across the country have had a high school season leading in to their summer season. And so, again, this is work that we know is really, really important. The awareness, the education is important. And then one step further, the action items.
Right.
Okay, so what we talked about last episode is that we would present 2 case studies. Now, we obviously have a handful of case studies, but we thought these 2 would be good to give you an idea of kind of these both represent. One is a little more of a standard case, and one was a case where we had to dig a little bit deeper.
And interestingly, they're both at the elbow, and both for very different reasons.
That's true.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah, that is true. We do get a lot of back stuff, but they are elbow related pain sites, I guess you would say. Okay, so athlete A, we'll call the first example here. Athlete A, I've referenced her in the last episode. She was pitching in Colorado. So as we know, this is like end of June. We'd say middle of the summer, but it's kind of like the last 2/3 of the summer. Had high school season. Leading up to this, pitches the majority of the innings in high school, if not every inning in high school. Has never had pain. So we see kind of like a slow decline in her velocity. We know that obviously fatigue is setting in. We're monitoring this throughout her sessions when she is able to report. And she doesn't live here, so she grabs some ball flight data closer to where she is at home. And we're seeing fatigue, but no pain has been in her story. So when she was in Colorado, she kind of panicked because she started to feel this elbow pain, which was radiating down through the forearm. And she panicked because, for all the reasons we talked about in our last 2 episodes, the athletes, they immediately think they're injured, which is really upsetting to them, obviously. These are athletes that are, if they're not currently being recruited or in the recruiting world, they've just committed. They have these, they're working so hard. They train so hard. And so obviously the first thing that I wanted to do was to be able to get on the phone with her and say, relax. This is not how it happens. It's typically not just, I felt nothing and then instantly I have an injury. This is the sign. It's your body giving you a signal that it's taking on too much work. This too high of a demand on a particular segment of the body. And in this case, what's going on in the forearm. So I said, okay, this athlete happened to be, we knew that she was going to be making a trip here to our Chicago headquarter location and just the following week. So I said, let's just keep working through some pain management things, do the types of things that I would recommend doing during pregame. And then let's dig into the story once we collect your data a little bit higher level data, deeper dive into her data just a week later. So what we saw is we did a reassessment and we certainly saw quite a regression going on in her her rotational capacity. I'm going to show this in just a second. What's interesting is that in and of itself is not surprising. Like all of our athletes,
Right.
we would expect to see that. So we did the assessment. I asked Laura to score her. I could see it on the spot. I'm like, okay, this looks as I would expect. Okay, but why the forearm pain now? And so I'm actually going to come over to my computer here. And what I want to show, this athlete came to visit us in May, kind of like this little gap between high school and summer season. As you could see, she had a little bit of a drop ball, really wasn't throwing the drop at all. It's not a pitch she felt comfortable commanding. So she was mostly throwing curve and rise and was starting to say like, oh, so my velocity's going down. My rise really is not that effective. I'm kind of just relying on curve. And so we were able to show her like, this is why. You've got a little horizontal on the curve. But other than that, there's nothing really going on vertically. So the idea of her throwing drop this was not the time for it. This was not a pitch that she currently felt like, this is in my wheelhouse. This is a pitch I'm relying on. And so instead, we took the approach, hey, you're already throwing rise. We know that in the past, this pitch did have some break. Let's put in some training strategies to grow a little bit of break. And so essentially, when she came back early July, what we saw is that she was successful with those goals, those performance goals. She was able to grow that rise ball about 2 inches, to really grow it almost 3 inches from where it was. And so that's great. She was having more success throwing rise. She was able to communicate that, like, hey, I'm getting more swings and misses off a rise ball. That's great. But it's really the combination of this. So this story alone is a real positive. This story is not great, obviously, because of lat length issues and issues with rotation, but we see this almost across the board with our athletes. There's nothing surprising about this. What I think is interesting about this case study is that it was the combination of this. It's the combination of the trunk no longer being able to contribute as much, while actively working to keep segmentation between forearm and upper arm, right? So it's a lot of stress. In episode 1, I believe it was, of this series, I showed an example of that. I showed some pictures of like where we see pain come from, or typical areas. And the last picture was this concept of a lot of segmentation. And so it was this combination of trunk really being fatigued and forearm really pushing for more, which is why we were able to kind of identify this is what's going on. Now, it's not as simple in this case just to say, well, stop throwing that pitch. She was seeing a lot more success. And so I will talk about this in just a bit, but we had to be, really careful with and saying like, well, this is the issue. Let's take that out of the equation. No, that's the ball flight data that is making her stand out against her competition. So it was important to keep it in the mix. Things like regaining stability and rotational capacity are more of like long-term things. These were not something like, well, let's hurry up and fix that before next weekend. So instead, we had to really attack it in a different way. But before I get into those details, Laura, maybe you can chime in on when we see so much of this elbow, forearm discomfort and pain. It's very, very clear that it's rare to see it with pitchers who don't produce bullet backspin. Right? Anything from bullet to backspin. Our top spin pitchers, typically we don't see it, even when they have the same trunk, stability, rotational capacity regressions that we're seeing in this case study. Talk to us a little bit more about what's going on anatomically to cause this.
Yep. So I think sometimes, baseball and softball get a lot of comparisons. We talked in the first episode that a lot of things that happen in softball are very insidious. They don't just show up randomly one day. They build and build and build over time. And so, a lot of times the more natural concept comes from softball's not up here in this 90-90 position with shoulder and elbow. That is pretty dangerous for the shoulder and is pretty tough from the elbow as well. So we know if you follow baseball, Tommy John, this concept of my ulnar collateral ligament, my UCL, when I get into this max layback above my shoulder here in baseball pitching, I can put a lot of tension on that. That's not happening in softball pitching, but those areas of pain can be really similar. And so what's really happening here is that at the same side of our elbow, on the medial side, we have a group of muscles that give us wrist flexion, some finger flexion, but what they really do is give us pronation, which is this palm up to palm down concept that we use obviously in layback through ball delivery. And so when backspin pitchers, gyro pitchers, anyone who's trying to create this bullet to backspin up, and they're trying to hold this position, we get this combination of, one, I'm holding this position, putting a lot of tension on it. There's a lot of really eccentric tension that's happening to hold that. And typically they're getting some curl of these fingers too as they're trying to hold that ball longer and longer. And so they have to hold it and then they have to get out of it really quickly. And that puts a ton of pressure and stretch and just work on this, what we call the flexor pronator mass. And so sometimes we get pitchers that say, my elbow hurts. I went to go see a doctor who, works with some MLB team and they're like, they think I have a UCL. And we usually say, you don't have a UCL.
Right.
Not a UCL. And the MRI says, you don't have a UCL because it's just not the same stress. We don't get that same stress. But all those areas are right next to each other. So it's a really common path to take, I think, if we're talking about diagnosis. But understanding softball pitchers and particularly their pitch profile could lead us to understanding a little bit better that this is more about just like what the forearm is doing, how we're holding it, and then this combination of having the fingers involved. It's a pretty consistent pattern.
Yeah, it's clear as day. And you're right. Like, we don't pretend to have MRI
No, I
glasses.
wish I did. That's my superhero power.
Right.
100%.
Yes. So I know you've said that before, but we don't, and we're obviously would never say, oh, we don't agree with the doctor. We would never say that. But behind closed doors, this has happened multiple times where they said, oh, I went to a doctor. He's the doctor of the, ex-MLB team.
Insert MLB team here.
Yes.
Right.
And I mean, so what they're trying to say is like, this is a highly qualified,
Right.
Medical professional who works with similar sport athletes
Sure.
all the time. And they're like, this is presenting exactly like UCL. And we're like, it's not going to be
The
a UCL.
nuances are different. The nuances
Right.
are different. The position our elbow and shoulder is in when we get through layback to ball delivery, it's different. And so it's the phrase of like, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck,
Right.
must be a duck. But again, it's not logical to say that must be what's happening here. But I think getting to that next level deeper of, okay, you don't have that UCL concept. What is happening? And it's very typically related to this bullet backspin concept.
Yeah, and it's an important discussion because that doctor is not obviously aware of the nuances of softball pitching of like, well, this is, you throw mostly backspin and that's why you're in this position. These are not details that they would know. Right. So it is interesting. It's essentially when you have a pitcher who's really relying on a ton of backspin, they are more likely to have forearm and elbow pain. Right. It's even more important then, especially these pitchers who are throwing at high velocity with spin like that, they just gotta have good trunk stability and they have to be able to maintain it, right? This is not like, oh, it's a bad thing. It's a great thing that they have that ball flight. That's what they're relying on from a performance standpoint, but you have to make sure there's some responsibility and understanding that they're more likely to experience some pain if they don't really have some good contribution from the body, from the trunk. Yep. So really my recommendations for this athlete were obviously a lot of submaximal throwing, right? Totally. And so we really, she was relying on, like her some overload to get into those positions. We measured whether or not she could stay in those positions or she could still achieve the right ball flight without having the overload. So I could pull that away from her a little bit just to kind of take out any added stress to the lower arm. And so we took some of those implements out. We still were working through those pitches a lot at low intensity. By the time we saw her, she was feeling pain-free there, but it was more just like to make sure, really adjusted what she was doing during the week. Honestly, it just disappeared, right? And so she told me the week after, actually, I even just talked to her a few days ago, and she was like, I kind of feel like, like not like silly, but I was really panicked. And then it was just like, it was nothing.
That's
like,
real though.
Right.
That's absolutely real.
Yeah, I'm like, no, it wasn't that it was nothing, but it was very important that for us, this just happened to be a case that as soon as she said it, we're like, we know what it is, right? Because we've seen so many of these cases. But it was important for us to show her that and then to say, because we're feeling very, very confident that this is what's going on, we have the strategies, the protocols that you should follow leading up to your game. And we're not going to say, stop throwing that pitch. That's the easy way to do it, right? This is like the healthcare system. Put the Band-Aid on what's hurting. Oh, just take the rise ball out. Don't throw backspin anymore. And we're like, no. You're throwing too much of it at too high of intensities. What I also suggested to her is that if you're throwing a lot in games, and basically like you're starting to feel, it's starting to get angry in games. She never got to this point, but you might want to tell your coach, hey, at that point, when I start hitting a number of X, I start to feel it. I have to lay off of rise a little bit, right? I got to change speeds a little bit more. There are things we can even communicate. So you might pull back on it a little bit, but it doesn't mean like that pitch is hurting you, take it out. It's not that simple. You got to understand all the variables that are combining.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Case study number 2, athlete B. Okay, so this one was interesting. So she came in, also does not live here, came in and said, I've been having elbow pain. I've had it this was something where she's like, I didn't even think to say it because I just had it like as long as I can remember, but it's like it gets worse.
Yeah, I think she said 2 years.
Yeah,
I think she was
2
dealing with
years.
for 2 years, and it didn't occur to her that might be something that to bring up on a regular basis. And
Yeah.
we talked about probably in her initial assessment, but it seemed to kind of just fall off the wayside because she hadn't brought it up again,
Right.
and just had been dealing with it,
Right.
which is we've normalized that.
So
culture-wise.
she's the only pitcher in her high school because obviously that's normal, like that's healthy for athletes. Unbelievable how many times we see that, right? So she threw every single game in high school. And that's obviously where it started, right? Like it started to like, she aggravate her a little bit. And then the summer went on and it's just like, it's hurting her pretty badly. So on the training floor, she kept saying my elbow, my elbow. And at the time, I knew that we were going to work a little bit. I was going to get some information from her on the floor, and then you and I were going to get on a call with her together, right? Have a meeting with her. So on the floor, plyos do not hurt her. She had a 0 pain during plyos, 0 pain during low intensity. High intensity, she would spike. Okay, so no surprise there. Of course, always going to spike, but I thought it was a good sign that she was able to do a lot of sub-max throwing without any discomfort because obviously that's our number one solution. But there was something kind of like, not bothering me, but something about this case, and I'm like, this doesn't match. She's an all topspin pitcher. So I think elbow pain, I'm thinking like, oh, we know it's the case study we just talked about. It's athlete A that we just said, where we know what's going on. There's none of that going on for this pitcher. Her layback position, her forearm position through decel is never really in a big stretch position. So then I started to say, where exactly is this elbow pain? And she started talking more like tricep. And so that's when I was like, I actually don't know what we're dealing with here. This is not the same scenario. I'm not even sure this is pitching. We ask about pain every single day for every one of our athletes. And really this concept of kind of like tricep area, the posterior side here, is typically not linked to pitching. We get more of this from other parts of the game. So this combination of this is where it is, the location of the pain, she's all top spin. I'm like, I think I have some theories. I went into that call with some theories, but of course I wanted to wait till Dr. Laura was on the call. So anyway, so we get on the call and maybe lay out what are some of the questions that you asked her. Yep. That led us to like, we see what's going on here.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of start off with the athletes describing the tricep area, right? So she's saying it's on the back of my elbow because that's an easy thing for her to recognize. It took a lot of questions. I wasn't with her physically, so this was not something that I put my hands on her and could, feel what was going on. But we had to get to a lot of questions. I mean, I at a certain point I was like, I think I'm out of questions at this point. You know what I mean? But we had to really get to, I wanted to understand again what we talked about in episode 2 of, what is this, how is this affecting you outside of pitching? When in the motion is this affecting you? And I think you had said she was being a little protective of that kind of ball delivery and deceleration as she was working on the training floor. So there was definitely something unique about this. It did not fit our typical patterns of, again, the medial elbow pain or, we don't have a heavy like lockout of extension that the tricep didn't make sense essentially from what we were talking about. And so we just started asking about, getting the whole story, getting the entire, concept of stressors. What other things does she do when she's not pitching? So she was kind of playing another position, but was taking a bulk of the innings for her travel team. So really doing a lot of pitching, but she was also hitting. Right. And so as we started to kind of discuss that, and her dad was sitting with her, he had commented of like, you've been taking a lot of swings lately. And so for context, she was a left-handed pitcher and a left-handed hitter. And so on the left side, right, she's describing this pain that's kind of on the back of the elbow. And I asked her a little bit more specifically, tell me, is it between kind of the bump where you'd hit your funny bone or the bump here on the end of your elbow? She's like, it's kind of more like in here. I'm like, okay, well, may not be dealing with tricep here, essentially. So then all I asked her to do is I said, okay, lock out your elbow. Let's add some wrist extension. Let's add the fingers. And as soon as she had that combination of all three, that area lit up for her. And so essentially what she had, we kind of got to this conversation with how the hitting volume she was doing was in her top hand as a hitter, whatever she was doing with gripping the bat, however she was holding the bat at the amount of volume she was swinging, she was asking these muscles, these tiny muscles in her hand that go up here to her elbow, to just be on fire all the time. And so now as a pitcher, I'm going to be right-handed, but as a pitcher, she's coming through and she's letting that go. Those have to stretch in order to deliver the ball. And so they're just getting angry every single time. But the root wasn't pitching. It was really about her having these fingers wrapped around the bat, the volume she was doing, being able to reproduce that through this movement. And, it wasn't the root of pitching because it didn't follow our typical patterns. And so, had pitching been at the root of that, I would have rethought a lot of things, to be honest, about the questions I was asking, because it just did not fit our typical patterns. But that's, I think, a really important case of you have to ask about all the stressors.
Yeah.
I think had her dad not mentioned, you've been in the cage a lot, you've been swinging a lot.
Yeah.
I think had he not mentioned that, I'm not sure we would have gotten to that point, right? In terms of, understanding all the stressors.
So what I thought was interesting, again, topspin pitcher, so I'm like, she's not really putting added stress on this. I didn't mention this, but I should have, because it's a very important piece of the puzzle. Her movement quality was fine.
Totally.
I mean, she honestly was like,
mobility was great. She was stable.
Yeah, she was stable.
Yeah.
So we were like, it's not just of course she's fatigued, but this is not the trunk is significantly, regressing in its contribution to the motion. We weren't seeing any of that. So it was that piece. Essentially, if she was only a hitter, not that necessarily volume is the amount of volume that she was doing was necessarily appropriate for what's going to be asked of her in the game. But if she was only a hitter, she probably wouldn't have felt anything. No. It was the combination. So very similar to athlete A, it was the combination of a little regression from the trunk, kind of a lot of regression, but a little regression from the trunk, asking the forearm to do a little bit more, it was just too much. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was this combination of, and the body was really still in good, holding up its end of the deal, essentially. But this, how much you're asking those small muscles to work in hitting. We knew that, in between pitching full games in high school, they would have practice where she would swing for hours. Yep. And now on her own, it just kind of became like a custom. It feels good to be in the cage. She's a big time hitter in travel ball. And so her dad said she was in the cage. She goes to the cage every single day. Yep. And so we have to really be careful of this. Is maybe we might say to a pitcher or say to an athlete, man, they're so dedicated. They work so hard. They're in the cage every day. But we need to see workload as a whole, because it's very, very important for us to understand that it was this combination of being a pitcher, being asked to throw so much volume, and then adding volume to hitting. This is just not working.
Right. I mean, and I think for both of those athletes, the difference in those sites of pain is less than an inch. I mean, those are not completely different areas of the body. And so, leaving it to the athlete to describe that pain without getting a little bit more into understanding their whole story, I think can lead you to chase the wrong things.
Yeah.
It can lead them to chase, doctor's visits and PTs and other healthcare practitioners that, they may not get to the root of it, or they may be chasing the wrong thing based on simply what the athlete's saying. And she's saying tricep, and to her, that's right. That's exactly what that area was. And it takes a little bit more of a nuanced conversation to get to, oh, it's not really your tricep. It's actually, it's part of your wrists, part of your fingers. They just all happen to be in the same area. But we're talking about literally less than an inch of difference in where those athletes were experiencing pain for totally two different reasons.
Right. Mm-hmm. So for this athlete, we obviously recommended that she hit just from one day during the week before the weekend at low volume, because hitting at this point, first of all, we're not chasing mechanical things in hitting. And so it's just more of to feel good, but she was able to go one day. I made sure that she knew on that day is a day that essentially, if you are pitching at all, it's certainly a day that's low volume and low intensity. Because her numbers were relatively higher than I'd like them to be. She was saying things like fives, which I don't love to hear at high intensity. So we really went to that she was allowed to throw, 2 days during the week only. One of them had to be low volume, low intensity. She never threw a high intensity pitch. She was only throwing at low intensity because that's where she had no pain. Right. So she was still staying connected to performance. And then she was allowed to throw one day where she was less than 20 full pitches at high intensity. But she could throw a little high intensity, but that could not get paired with that hitting day just until things came down. So she stayed with that. She had about 2 weeks. So we wanted to really like, let's attack this. Let's get it to come down. 2 weeks before having to play again. We were really lucky with timing because she had a break before national. So I have obviously checked in with her. She was feeling great during those weeks. She's not pain-free in nationals, but her number is much, much lower. When it spikes during games, she's at like a 2-3. So essentially it's this combination of, again, we didn't have to shut anything down. We had to really educate her on how to take volume down for both, and particularly intensity down for pitching along with volume, and then how to work them together. I think this concept of like siloing what we do, we talked about in episode 1, siloing strength and conditioning and pitching, but we see it all the time. Hitting and pitching gets siloed. Pitching and overhand throwing gets siloed as if like, well, I'm done pitching, but now I'm going to throw overhand.
With a different arm.
Yeah.
It's the same arm.
It's crazy. And so it is very, very important to understand everything that's going on. And not only to be able to educate the athlete of maybe where the origin of this pain is, but to then reprogram and come up with a plan. So I think for us, it's not just the fact of how we use submax throwing. It's our ability to really understand all of the pieces of the puzzles. And because we don't work in like a lesson model, we program entirely what someone really should be doing throughout their weeks. We're able to make those suggestions across the board. And obviously, we've had a lot of positive, this has have a positive impact on a lot of athletes, particularly where all they have is like a week or two to at least get that number to come down.
Yeah, and I think just like from an efficiency standpoint, if these athletes had not had potentially access to us, they could have chased some remedies that, again, led them to physicians or other healthcare practitioners at, their parents' dime. Things like icing and foam rolling and all these different types of topical treatments. Nothing wrong with those things, but it doesn't get to the root.
No, right.
And ultimately getting to the root of it and trying to understand how to reduce the stress even temporarily, to take some pressure off that area is really what's going to get to the heart of that. So these topical things of biofreezes and icy hots, they're great. If they help you, fantastic. But it's a Band-Aid, right? It's just a Band-Aid. And so I think without having this perspective of getting to the root of it, I think a lot of times athletes they'll spin their wheels a bit on trying to chase some treatments that are just Band-Aids.
I will say one other thing we did with this athlete is that we really made sure she understood what each of her pitches were doing. And we cut out all excess pitch types. We're like, this is your best sink pitch. This is your best horizontal pitch. Like those are it. Do not waste volume on other pitches. And then we really recommended for game days what her warm-up should look like. One, because she's hitting and pitching, but just also she's in active paint. So it's important to really, preserve what's in the tank. And so we talked about plyos, low intensity only, and being under 20 pitches just to mix at the end at high intensity to feel mentally ready with how she's commanding her pitches. So there was a couple pieces, as far as the recommendation of just around generally like how to manage high intensity volume as well around game day. So I think those have been really beneficial for her as well. Yeah. So these are just 2 case studies. Like I said, no 2 athletes are the same. And even when we're like, oh, backspin pitch or elbow pain, we know this one. It's never identical for every single athlete with what they have going on and what program changes you might be making or suggesting for them. But this gives you an idea of like how we go about getting the entire story, getting all the cards on the table, and then ultimately being able to be like, this is what we think the origin is, so this is the plan of attack. And then how do we know if it works? We're measuring it, right? There's objective data of like what that pain number is. So I think those are just some great examples.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So as I said, this is arguably, I feel like, I love working with pitchers on the floor and getting them to get 3 more inches of break in one direction or the other. That stuff is so exciting and seeing all that click for them. But there's something about when an athlete is in such a vulnerable state because they feel hurt and they're afraid of injury, and to be really like walking side by side with them to get them through that and to show them like you're going to be okay. Like we got it. It's work that I know like our heart and soul is in. And I'm so proud of us, obviously, for really diving into this world. And we've, been able to help a lot of athletes. So the goal, obviously, is to keep them out of that position in the first place. But as we talked about in episode 1, some of these external variables they're up against with workload is so extreme. It's just inevitable. So at the very least, we know we have some systems and protocols in place to help them through that time.
Yep. So my favorite conversations are just talking to families and athletes who, they're coming back from injury or they've had this cycle, and we get to have a conversation about, how we approach things, and I can feel a sense of relief from them. I can see it, through the computer that they're just like, okay, someone's going to help us with this plan.
Yeah. All right, so thank you again for joining in of Redefine the Circle. Next episode 4, we're going to talk about when, unfortunately, an athlete does experience an injury, whether it's from pitching or not, how we make sure that we attack the ramp up in an appropriate way. This has been a piece for us that we've realized is just not information that's out there, as we'll go into detail in our next episode, but what ramp up protocols really look like here for us at S2 to make sure that athletes are going from not pitching at all to being able to meet their performance goals. So stay tuned for episode 4 coming at you soon. Thanks again for joining today, Laura. Thanks for coming back. We'll see you next time, everyone. Between now and next episode, remember, keep questing on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone.